Hello, everybody. Hard to follow Anita Dunn. We will do our best. So there was a super interesting graph in FT recently, which showed two trend lines. One was GDP growth, and one was CO2 emissions. And basically, since 1990, for almost every country, except for literally a couple like Sweden, those two things are in lockstep. The more GDP growth you have, the more emissions you create. Until 2010, when in many countries, including the US, the UK, Australia, Spain, even the UAE, they start to diverge, and we see GDP growth and a reduction in emissions, which is pretty interesting. So hopefully we'll get to the why is that happening on this panel. But first, it'd be great if you could just all introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Nili Gilbert, the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. At Carbon Direct Capital, we are investors in carbon management. Think about the technologies required to capture carbon, remove it from the atmosphere, recycle it into other useful products, and then clean fuels like green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel, all driven with a strong science-first focus. I also chair the advisory board for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ as we call it. This is the alliance of over 550 financial institutions committed to net zero.
I'm Gaurab Chakrabarti. I'm the co-founder and CEO for Solugen. We are attempting to decarbonize the chemicals industry by using more sustainable feedstock to make the chemicals and materials you interact with every day, the plastic on the chair you're sitting in, the chemicals that were used to treat the water that you're drinking, all of it comes from antiquated processes. And what we're trying to do is turn those process technologies into more sustainable practices so we can have a decarbonized economy.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you this afternoon. I'm Maria Woodman. I'm a principal at the RockCreek Group as part of our direct investing practice. Those who know RockCreek, I think, typically know us largely for our asset management capabilities. We manage about $15 billion of institutional money. And a large portion of that has been focused on sustainability. You know, our clients come to us often with sustainability as a focus of their mandates, largely because of the DNA of the firm. We were founded about 20 years ago by 𝐻𝐢𝐬𝐵, who was the treasurer and chief investment officer at the World Bank. And 20 years ago, you know, the development finance community was a place where sustainability was really starting to take hold. And 𝐻𝐢𝐬𝐵 believed that over time, that was going to move into the private capital markets as well. And so that's really why she founded RockCreek. I was brought on board to help build out our direct investing practice. Very quietly, RockCreek, in addition to our asset management work, has been doing more co-invests alongside our GP relationships, but also some direct investing activity. And clients want to get closer to those assets. They want more exposure to the types of solutions that are going to have an impact on addressing climate change, solving for climate risk. And so I was brought on to help build out that platform.
So first, just super simple question. Why should anyone listening care about what we're talking about? Why should they care about climate tech? Why should they care about climate investing at all?
Well, of course, there's the human imperative of managing climate change. A world where we don't solve this problem is one that none of us, nor certainly any of our future generations, want to live in. But I think what's even more at the heart of your question is why should this be interesting to investors? It's estimated that achieving the transition by 2050 will require investments of around $150 trillion in capital. And so it's true, there will be a lot that we let go of in the climate transition, but there's a ton of opportunity in what we need to build. Of course, also, that's the upside. When you talk about the downside risk of getting this problem wrong, the Swiss Re Institute estimates a 20% permanent hit to GDP in a business as usual scenario. And as you know, GDP is the foundational building block of all of the asset classes that we invest in. So there's also an imperative for investors to step in to manage the systemic risk that's presented by climate while seeking the idiosyncratic investment opportunities to solve the problem. So when it comes to those idiosyncratic opportunities, the IEA focuses on the energy transition. There, by 2030, we need to scale up investments in clean energy by 3 times to about $4 trillion per year, right? By 2030, that's a huge opportunity. I also love our founder at Carbon Direct, Jonathan Goldberg, often reminds us that by 2050, the amount of carbon that we're gonna need to be managing to maintain net zero is 2 times the physical volume of fossil fuels that we're moving around the world today. So when I hear these facts, I'm concerned as a citizen, but I'm also intrigued as an investor.
Yeah, I think there's 2 buckets, right? There's the human bucket. You have to be a good human being. Our parents told us so that's why we have to do it. The second bucket being that the cost of capital is just gonna keep going up and up if you're not focused on decarbonization. An example that I like to think through is, if you look at the technologies, the chemical technologies that were scaled back in the 70s, you cannot build those technologies anew today because the regulations around environmental release and energy requirements are just infeasible for you to make any money off of. That's where we're at today, where all of these new technologies that we're developing, it looks like it's expensive, but the cost of capital for these technologies is gonna drop pretty tremendously. And so the weighted cost of capital is actually gonna be much lower than traditional petrochem-based processes.
I think what I might add to that is a little bit of a reflection on kind of where we are today relative to where we've been in the past as it relates to climate investing. So I think a lot of folks in this room probably have some scar tissue around Clean Tech 1.0. I think even those of us on the stage have some scar tissue around that. And I think, I've been reflecting a lot on like what looks different today. And at a macro level, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the way we contextualized Clean Tech 1.0 was to think of it as a vertical. Right? I'm investing in clean tech, I'm investing in fintech, I'm investing in healthcare, and I gotta keep that kind of silo and really think through that sort of narrow lens when I'm defining what the aperture of my sort of solution set for investment is. One of the things that's interesting now is that because of a lot of the tailwinds, right, the corporate commitments to net zero, the sort of movement of capital into the space, changing consumer preferences, you can start to think about climate actually as a horizontal that sits across all of those verticals. And when you change that framework as an investor, you do open the aperture of the possible in terms of where you can invest. TAMs start to look a whole heck of a lot bigger. I think that was one of the challenges with Clean Tech 1.0 was like, energy and utilities, that's a small TAM, like why do I care about that? And the narrative is changing. I think more people are internalizing. Climate touches everything. Everything we do produces or consumes carbon, and the way that we interact with that will have a material impact on our business. And so for me, that gets me really excited because what now we're talking about is an entire economic transition, right? We are transitioning an entire economy, and if you can't make money doing that, I don't know where you can make money.
So, be a good person, solve the climate crisis, generate returns. This all sounds great, but as you mentioned, like people were singing this sort of climate kumbaya a really long time ago. And if I remember correctly, a lot of people lost a lot of money and the climate crisis didn't get saved. And so I just heard that one of the reasons that things are different now is because we have, regulatory tailwinds. So is this entire space just a bet on like changing regulation and changing policy, or is there more to it than that?
Well, first of all, at Carbon Direct Capital, we actually don't bet on policy. We're finding great companies where we focus on prevailing policy today, and really just looking at traditional investment metrics. We're looking for companies that are generating revenues, they are capital efficient, they have accelerating growth, and they're doing all of this on the back of existing policy, right? And so this isn't futurism, policy futurism. This is just good bottom-up fundamental investing. But it's true that the policy inflection that's in place is huge. We really see, not just in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, but in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in Japan, everywhere around the world, actually, I would say a rising policy competitiveness, where in order to be a leader, or really perhaps to participate in the future global economy, you need to think about the structure of that economy being run in a clean and green way. So I don't think that this is just a policy bet. I think that there are already great companies like Solugen, doing good work today, highly investable, and investing today, you have an additional wind at your back to be able to achieve the bright future that we expect, both as investors and as people.
So though we don't need it, we do have these regulatory tailwinds that didn't exist in 2006. We have changing consumer preferences, which didn't exist. Gaurab, I'd be interested, are there sort of fundamental differences in the technology since 2006?
1,000%. So I think I look at everything quite simply. I think this is a supply and demand problem, right? Now with regulatory environment and these corporate commitments, the demand side is starting to go up. That's unarguable. But the supply side has also changed dramatically, right? So if you look at Solugen, when we started the business, the cost for us to make our products was astronomical, because the cost to actually read and write DNA, which is what we use for our technology, was so high that there was no way that we can make a single dollar on a product that we made. We would spend $100 a kilogram just to get our product out. That's ridiculous. Now that cost basis, just in the span of five and a half years, is less than $1 a kilogram. That's insane, right? But it's completely predictable. But the second order effect of that is, well, how are these things going to then be applied to the supply issue of solving climate? And we saw this in solar, we saw this with EVs. The cost curve, we always write it down. But because of the leaps that we're making in a lot of disparate fields like biology, computer science, and chemistry, I actually think we're at this really weird inflection point where all of a sudden the supply side, the cost of doing business can come down faster than the demand of these regulatory environments can move. So the spread is much bigger than we've ever seen it before. So going back to my weighted cost of capital statement, you've just created your ROIC and your WACC to such a high spread that all of a sudden you can make profits that look like traditional petrochem-like margins.
Interesting. Yeah. And so given that this policy is happening, like with the IRA and with other things that we expect coming, what sorts of particular companies are going to be most advantaged by these policy changes? Maybe Maria, you want to start?
Sure. So I do want to say a quick word about policy, because I think policy sometimes gets a little bit of a dirty rap. And I do think we need to be prudent, right? When we underwrite our deals, we are not underwriting a base case assuming that there's going to be, any kind of subsidy that exists, right? We look at it as upside. We also look at it as sort of an accelerant, right? Like pulling forward into the money things that might not have been in the money without that subsidy as those things are coming down the cost curve. And so I think that's where, you are going to see a lot of advantages for things like green hydrogen, things like carbon capture, where it's really, really hard to get those projects underwritten with policies like sort of the direct pay provisions on the sort of production tax credits for carbon capture, for hydrogen. Those projects start to look a lot more attractive today. I think where we sometimes get in trouble with policy, and this happened a little bit the last time around, there's a temporal challenge, right? Because you need those incentives, those policies, to bridge you all the way to cost competitiveness. And solar now is, right? And I want to be very clear, the reason that we have 3-4 cent per kilowatt hour solar today is largely on the back of a lot of those incentives and a lot of those policy decisions that were made around the Stimulus Act and things like that.
And now we're finally seeing the
impact. So the challenge becomes, how do you ensure that those subsidies are going to be in place so that you do get to a point where those things can stand alone? And I think that's the challenge for us as underwriters is to figure out how to manage that temporal risk and not be dependent on those subsidies in the long run. And we certainly, I think, would never look at a technology that is going to be dependent on those subsidies in the long run.
So in solar, how long was the lag between the sort of policy boost and solar being competitive just purely based on market dynamics?
A decade.
A decade. Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the original incentives, 2-3 years, right, that doesn't work. Here, the direct pay provision for carbon capture is 12 years long. You get 12 years of direct pay, which, just to clarify, that means that you don't have to have a tax liability in order to monetize the credit.
So what would have made that delay shorter? Instead of 10 years, how could it have been 5 years?
So I think technology.
You want to switch chairs?
Yeah, you want to take this? Okay.
So I think your point, right, around technology has changed. AI makes a difference, right?
Okay.
Our ability to pull these things down the cost curve, I think, does look different because of the technology regime that we're in.
So like what?
Hey. I've got an interesting thought. According to the IPCC, we need to cut emissions by over 50% to keep warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's just a simply massive, massive drop. And so what do we need? And I'm most interested here now in market-based solutions. Let's maybe leave policy aside, to overcome the challenge of that scale.
One of the things we talk a lot about the scarcity of resources, right, to be able to drive to net zero. One of the things that we think is really important to focus on is the need for human capital and the way that we structure human capital to be able to solve the problem. So one of the challenges is expertise in silos. So the founding vision for Carbon Direct, which Carbon Direct Capital also has a sister company, Carbon Direct Inc., which houses a huge science team. We've got about 40 PhDs who sit there and partner with our investment experts at Carbon Direct Capital in doing the technical diligence that's required to move money into these solutions. Policy experts. Yes, there's amazing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, expertise to really understand the best ways to leverage that around the world to find solutions. Excellent entrepreneurs, excellent business people, technology leaders. One of the challenges that we hope that we're overcoming here is the ability to kind of used to be one team of experts passes the ball to the next team and passes the ball to the next team. Takes a long time. And this team kicks it back over here. How can we stack up our efforts because of the urgency of solving the climate challenge so that we can move much faster in an interdisciplinary way?
Yep, talent drives it all. Gaurab, what do we need to scale these solutions fast?
I actually think, I like this thing that you said, stacking, right? So like, I actually look at it from the engineering and technology side, where let's say we've got this great technology that decarbonizes chemicals. You press a button and it makes a carbon negative chemical. That by itself is not going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is what are the downstream benefits of this new technology or whatever it is that's sustainable that allow people to do their business more efficiently. So in our example, we realized that if we can make the chemical plant smaller, using our technology, we can have it closer to the customer site and actually have decreased transport costs, decreased safety incidents that can be harmful for the people handling those chemicals. All of a sudden, these things became much more tangible to the customer than just the carbon benefit. So fundamentally, that carbon benefit has to drive some tangible change that makes the customer or whoever it is, in this case, the customer, life better. And I think that's where solar is finally at now, where now all of a sudden it's cheap enough that it's much easier for me to just put a solar panels on my roof if I don't want to use nat gas. And I think there's other areas where the technology is getting to a point where the downstream effects are going to be felt by people, and that's what's going to drive more investment into the technology itself.
Yeah. So for us at RockCreek, the way we think about it is actually, we care a lot more about thinking about how we get to 2030 before we get to 2050, right? There's a lot of people who are focused on 2050, and we absolutely need that because that is the place where there's going to be some moonshot technologies that have to be commercialized to get us that last, call it 20% of carbon reductions. But the reality is that if you think about 2030 and you think about building the bedrock of the emissions reductions we need to even have a shot at 2050, the technologies that we need to get us to 2030 goals, 82% of them, according to the IEA, are commercially viable today, right? They are commercially in market. They have unit economics that make sense. They maybe are kind of boring stuff. Solar's boring now, right?
Yeah.
Energy efficiency is boring now. HVAC, boring now. EVs are increasingly getting boring. But the reality is we still need to execute against those strategies. We still need capital flowing into those spaces. And you can still make a lot of money sort of building businesses in those sectors because they're finally at the point where you can get scale. And scale matters in a business that ultimately is sort of driven by commodities, and the energy space and the space that we operate is. And so we look at those kind of investments, right? We're looking at companies that are developing solar, that are developing maybe distributed solar because interconnection queues for utility scale solar are so backed up that it's gonna be years before we unstick that, right? There are places, tankless water heaters. We're looking at a company right now that does tankless water heaters. So boring. Water heating is 25% of the energy costs of a commercial building. Tankless water heaters can reduce that sometimes by up to 80%. That's significant carbon reductions that are gonna get us to the 2030 goals so that we are set up in 2030 to have Solugen and all of these other companies getting us all the way to net zero by 2050.
HVAC is not boring. Let's just set the record straight.
A lot of people think it is, but I disagree.
So everyone here is convinced that there's a ton of money to be made. I'm looking in their eyes. I can tell they're like, I'm all in. Climate tech investing is where it's at. Where should they be putting their money? Where's the opportunity in the climate tech or climate capital stack?
You know, we're really excited about areas like green hydrogen. We're really excited about provisions for carbon capture. When you think about carbon utilization, this is exciting because there's a natural revenue stream, right? Because you're creating products that you put directly into the market. And all of these areas are being accelerated in their use by the Inflation Reduction Act, and also because of the huge demand push that we now have from corporates who are making pledges to net zero. Carbon Direct Capital is unique in being focused as a niche player on the field of carbon management alone. But when you think about all of the emissions in the world, I really appreciated what you said about how they're in everything that we do. We think that this is a massive space and a massive opportunity for investors to get involved.
Biggest need in the capital stack, Gaurab?
Sorry?
Biggest need in the climate tech capital stack?
So I actually think it's going to be in the education state, because what we've discovered, not like education like in schools, but educations in the context of how do we retrain workers who have been in the oil and gas industry or the hard industries, and to start thinking about to repurpose those skills into the climate space. That is a problem that if we solve, this will actually move much faster. And I think there's actually returns to be had there.
Trade schools.
Trade schools.
Yeah,
I think
agree.
those types of things are actually really great investments for climate.
So I invest in companies, I invest in corporate equity. And so I'm gonna talk about a part of the capital stack that I don't even invest in, but I think is absolutely critical.
Are you sure you don't just want to talk your own book?
Well, no,
All right.
but here's the thing, my book only works if we get this part of the capital stack rolling, which is project finance. And in particular, first of a kind project finance for new technologies that are coming to market that might be traditionally viewed as unbankable by traditional project financiers, right? If you're bringing a technology to market for the first time, who's gonna build that project? I don't really want you building it with my very expensive cost of capital corporate equity dollars. So there's a role for project finance here and first of a kind project finance that truly is catalytic. You're starting to see, interestingly enough, corporates play an interesting role here and corporate balance sheets doing really interesting things with first of a kind project finance. You know, in the SAF space, in the direct air capture space, right? They want access to those molecules or those credits. Those are going to be way more expensive for a first project than when they're able to do that at scale. And so that's a chicken and an egg question for them. Do I want to buy, 500 a ton DAC credits when I need them to be $100? So how do you bridge that gap? And how do you get a corporate comfortable with that? One of the things that you're seeing them do is say, I will be sponsor equity in a project, but I also want to participate in the upside of the top co.
That's great, yeah.
And that top co equity can help you bridge the arbitrage between the price it is today and the price it will be when that corporate equity is way more valuable.
So there you have it, folks, the roadmap for how to be a good human and make a ton of money. I want to thank the panelists.
Thank you, Seth.